They once worked together a long time ago. They're not friends now. They don't like each other. And yeah, 50 has taken every shot, especially when Diddy has been down.
I realized Big was that type of rapper that he could get at somebody, and I think Puff was trying to tell him, don't go that route. You understand what I'm saying? But still putting out songs like Who Shot Ya in the intro, but telling Big not to go at nobody, which was crazy.
A $1 million betrayal is being dragged into the light, and the long-held silence around it is finally cracking. What many dismissed as buried history or faded nostalgia is suddenly alive again, charged like a live wire at the worst possible moment. This isn't reading like rumor or old drama resurfacing. It feels like leverage being pulled with precision. Insiders are circulating a claim they say can't be taken back, followed by noticeably tighter statements and carefully measured words as a court date looms. A Netflix series set for early December 2025 introduces taped allegations that money was offered to make Shakur disappear, while internal label journals reportedly reveal suspicious travel movements tied to Las Vegas. At the center, Duane Davis faces charges for orchestrating the shooting and is scheduled for trial on February 9th, 2026, as a separate civil filing claims a threat that invokes Shakur's fate to enforce silence. The dates, the numbers, the quotes, they sit there unanswered, heavy and unresolved. If this were nonsense, the response would be calm. But instead, every move suggests a machine still grinding forward, with consequences that haven't finished landing.
I believe it, because he wasn't talking just to be talking. I felt he was also coming straight, because there was a big war behind that. A war that they lost. And I think it was a war that destroyed their neighborhood.
The documentary doesn't slip in quietly, and its timing feels anything but accidental, landing in early December 2025, just as court filings, old interview tapes, and internal notes begin circulating again, with people close to the situation insisting the release isn't entertainment but pressure. On the surface, it plays like a routine streaming series revisiting old theories and repeating claims long denied, letting viewers draw their own conclusions, yet that explanation falls apart when matched with what's happening in real time. The show leans heavily on statements attributed to Duane Davis, the same man charged in Las Vegas and set to face a jury on February 9th, 2026, pulling his past law enforcement accounts back into the spotlight rather than leaving them buried. Industry sources argue this isn't coincidence, because reviving those claims now reshapes the environment around the trial, turning what could have been a cold, controlled case into something volatile, public, and impossible to manage, changing how everyone involved talks, moves, and stays silent. Front and center is the allegation that $1 million was offered to make a rival disappear, framed not as rumor, but as something allegedly spoken in private rooms and repeated for years, with a promise aimed at two targets, a detail that gives the story a harsh, transactional logic. If money is named, someone was supposed to collect. Yet insiders note no payment ever appears to have landed, and that absence becomes a tension point, a missing payout that breeds resentment, loose ends, and reasons for people to start talking decades later, a contradiction the documentary leaves unresolved, so the silence itself grows louder. As the narrative deepens, the focus shifts from street-level chaos to something more methodical, introducing Kirk Burroughs not as performer, but as the money man at Bad Boy, the person who tracked budgets and daily logistics and documented everything in journals dating back to what he calls Day Zero. The series shows scanned pages treated like artifacts, including one detail that keeps surfacing in private conversations. An unusual request to rent cars and drive from New York to Las Vegas around the time of the Mike Tyson fight in September 1996, a choice that feels off in an industry where flights are easier and faster, and when that cross-country drive is placed beside what later happened in Las Vegas, the story stops feeling random and starts feeling deliberate.
With the series, with the film?
I mean, I think the intention is to give a more full-bodied experience to what happened, from the people that agreed to sit down and to participate. And I feel like the film asks a lot of questions, maybe more questions are asked than answers given.
That's when another name begins to surface, carefully and indirectly, never front and center, but always hovering at the edges. Eric Von Zipmartin, described by multiple voices as a connector with access, influence, and a reputation that travels faster than any paper trail. People close to the situation say he isn't portrayed as the one making decisions or pulling triggers, but as the hinge that lets everything else move, someone who facilitates travel, communication, and deniability. In the documentary, his name appears alongside mentions of vehicles, cross-country trips, and half-spelled-out conversations. And industry insiders insist that framing is intentional, because once you start identifying facilitators, the story stops looking like impulse or chaos and starts looking like structure, and structure suggests planning. Official responses remain flat and dismissive. Denials, claims of nonsense, the argument that repeating old accusations doesn't make them true, which sounds neat on paper but clashes with the visible reactions. No aggressive counterattack, no point-by-point breakdown, no real explanation for why the same names and allegations keep resurfacing. Instead, there's selective engagement and long stretches of silence, which insiders say isn't neutrality but strategy, since pushing back too hard risks legitimizing claims, though that same silence leaves gaps others eagerly fill. The tension spikes further when civil filings enter the picture, including a New York lawsuit alleging that years after the 1996 shooting, a threat was made invoking that tragedy as proof of power, with language blunt enough to intimidate. Those close to the case say it reframes the past not as a closed chapter, but as leverage, suggesting silence is enforced not just through contracts or money, but through reminders of consequences. At that point, the narrative shifts from history to mechanism, implying the shooting isn't just something that happened once, but something that continues to shape behavior years later, making the documentary feel less like a retrospective and more like a warning flare.
Chaotic. It's hard to actually figure out what's what, but it's becoming clearer. It's becoming clearer and clearer, but...
Here's where the story begins to bend. Because Duane Keith D. Davis is no longer a background figure, but the clear pressure point at the center of everything. Sitting charged in Las Vegas and accused of orchestrating the shooting, he watches his past statements resurface, replayed, and reinterpreted not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. People close to the legal process say, this is dangerous territory, where the line between testimony and spectacle starts to blur, turning legal defense into public theater. What's being framed as clarification also traps him, locking him into versions of events he has already tried to soften or walk back. Insiders say that as February 9th draws closer, the real question isn't simply whether his story holds up under scrutiny, but who else gets pulled into its orbit and who stands to gain if it falls apart. With every repetition, the pressure tightens and the stakes rise for everyone connected.
He's saying that, Diddy, he put a hit out on you and Tupac, and that's the reason why Tupac got in Vegas. So, yeah, man. How you feel about that?
Well, first thing first. I mean, that conversation been out there. He put his truth out there. A lot of other people put their truth out there.
The documentary doesn't isolate a single tragedy. Instead, it pulls in the later shooting of Christopher Wallace in March 1997 and frames it as part of the same ecosystem of rivalry, fear, and miscalculation, presenting claims that he didn't even want to be in Los Angeles, that travel plans shifted, and that he ended up in a hostile environment anyway. No single detail proves anything on its own, but a pattern rattles people who followed this story for decades. 2 high-profile shootings months apart, both unresolved for years, both surrounded by warnings that were allegedly ignored. When that pattern is placed alongside allegations of executive influence and financial control, the narrative expands from personal conflict to something systemic, less about individual beef and more about structural failure. By this point, nothing feels accidental, yet nothing feels settled either. The missing money, the strange travel decisions, the facilitator names that hover without fully surfacing, and lawsuit language that repurposes an old shooting as intimidation all combine into a shape people recognize but can't quite define. Insiders say the real threat isn't what's already been said but what hasn't. And with a trial date locked in and more documents rumored to exist, the question isn't whether the story grows, but who decides when it stops and how far they'll go to contain it. As the situation stretches on, it starts to resemble less a single explosive allegation and more a long-running pattern of intimidation, humiliation, and pressure within the same orbit, described by former associates as routine rather than rare, where contracts, access, and loyalty function less like business tools and more like leverage. Seen through that lens, earlier details, control issues, resentment toward independent artists, constant monitoring of alliances, feel less like personality quirks and more like parts of system designed to prevent anyone from drifting away, a system that doesn't need courtroom proof to operate, only belief, because belief alone, insiders say, is what keeps people quiet long after the moment has passed.
He's 3 law firms on retainer. I don't know how much money is coming in, but I know that a lot of money is going out every single month for Diddy.
This is why the old studio incident in New York never really fades, even when no one mentions outright. Because its unresolved nature becomes a kind of silent evidence for people who lived through it, a lingering belief that betrayal happened inside what was supposed to be a controlled space. That idea fractures trust for good and turns every conflict that follows into a question of setup instead of chance. And once artists start pointing fingers at executives rather than rivals, the story shifts from rivalry to governance. Who decides where people go, who they're placed aside, and what risks are acceptable? Viewed through that lens, last-minute travel changes and strange decisions stop feeling accidental and start looking like authority being exercised with consequences no one wants to admit. Money keeps surfacing as a quiet through line too. Not just the alleged $1 million at the center of the main claim, but the everyday financial pressures insiders say define the environment. Advances that trap, expenses that linger long after careers end, even posthumous accounting that feels punitive instead of protective. With control centralized and losses quietly passed down, the missing payout becomes more than a loose end. It feels symbolic, hinting at either deception or intervention, both of which create enemies, and enemies with time and nothing left to protect tend to talk when circumstances change. And the circumstances are changing now, not only because of a courtroom date, but because a wave of civil filings is dragging private experiences into public view, all orbiting the same center of gravity. The allegation that a past shooting was invoked as proof of reach and consequence reshapes how years of silence are understood, making people who once seemed complicit look more cornered than compliant, and suggesting fear, not consent, kept mouths shut. That shift raises the uncomfortable question insiders keep circling. If intimidation was strong enough to delay claims for years, what else has been delayed, buried, or redirected? Because while the legal system moves slowly, pressure doesn't. It builds, and then it accelerates.
I think that the goal of what the film is trying to do is to let the audience kind of come in to ask questions like, you know, in a trial where there's so much media coverage, you know, before, during, and after, were their decisions, you know, colored by certain things, and who got the benefit of the doubt, you know, in that courtroom?
As the pressure builds, the reactions start telling their own story, sometimes louder than any official statement. Some figures talk nonstop, tossing out accusations that feel raw and personal, while others disappear behind blanket denials and carefully measured silence, and the imbalance is hard to ignore. People close to the industry say the ones who overshare often do it because they've already lost control, while the quiet ones still believe silence can protect them. But silence hits differently when it's surrounded by documents, recordings, and witnesses willing to go on a record. It stops looking like dignity and starts looking like calculation, and calculation naturally invites scrutiny. Every unanswered question becomes an opening for someone else to step in and shape the narrative. And with the looming trial, all of this shifts from gossip to risk management, because the mere possibility of sworn testimony changes the stakes. Those who once thrived on ambiguity now face the threat of fixed, documented accounts. And insiders say that's when alliances begin to strain, old loyalties get reconsidered, former enemies explore cooperation, and people who once relied solely on reputation start worrying about evidence. In the end, the real fear isn't conviction or acquittal. It's exposure. Exposure how decisions were made, how influence really moved, and how problems were handled when money and image were everything.
Interestingly, we haven't seen the indictments yet. There's been some time lag. I suppose it will take some time to go through all the forensic, evidence.
What people are whispering about now feels heavier than rumor, because the conversation has shifted to something far more serious. Federal attention. According to sources familiar with the situation, the FBI is no longer viewing the Shakur and Biggie cases as sealed cultural tragedies from another era, but as potentially interconnected events that may warrant fresh scrutiny. There hasn't been any dramatic reopening announcement or flashy task force rollout, just a quiet change in posture, the kind that happens behind the scenes, where old files reportedly get pulled back out not for nostalgia, but to look for patterns that were missed or ignored. The logic is simple and unsettling at the same time, when the same names, facilitators, and financial questions keep surfacing around multiple catastrophic moments. Coincidence stops feeling like a convincing answer, and once federal eyes start refocusing, the entire equation shifts, because the kind of influence that might work inside an industry bubble doesn't carry the same weight when the pressure comes from outside, especially not under the scope of federal investigation.
By the rules. You got a lot of people playing both sides of the fence. But at the same time, if your name's Suge Knight, the authority's never gonna treat you fair. My whole case in this case wasn't treated fair.
People close to the process say this renewed attention isn't sparked by a single explosive revelation, but by slow accumulation. The stacking of old interviews, civil filings, financial inconsistencies, and decades of unanswered questions until the patterns become too aligned to ignore. The FBI doesn't move on belief, reputation, or public narratives. It moves on link analysis, money trails, and behavioral consistency. And when stories once brushed off as rumors start appearing in sworn statements and recorded sessions, the threshold shifts from speculation to mandatory interest. Insiders say that's why some reactions feel restrained instead of combative, because federal scrutiny isn't something you can shout down or spin away. It's slow, methodical, often invisible, and far more unnerving to people who are used to controlling perception. That seriousness also reframes the role of peripheral figures who once seemed irrelevant. Since associates in the background suddenly matter when they connect overlooked dots, and travel records, shell companies, and long-forgotten relationships gain new weight under a federal lens. People who once spoke casually begin rethinking what they've said and to whom, and the panic doesn't arrive loudly, but shows up as silence, quiet legal consultations, and sudden distance between former allies. The fear isn't immediate charges so much as the exposure of systems that may have operated unchecked for decades, because once that curtain lifts, it rarely falls back into place. What makes this moment feel decisive, those watching say, is the sense that time is no longer on anyone's side. Federal agencies may not rush, but they don't forget, and if the FBI is truly taking these cases seriously now, it signals the end of the narrative phase and the start of consequences, not necessarily neat answers or public closure, but a kind of pressure that loyalty and silence can't contain, the kind that forces everyone to reassess what they know, what they tolerated, and what they're willing to carry alone, until stories that survive for decades on myth begin to crack under the weight of reality.
Well, you know, I think that the biggest marker of what makes this film or this series different is how much time we took into putting into the making of the film, doing our due diligence to get the right voices, you know, to the table, and you know, this is a series that spans over 30 years, so just by covering that much time, it took a lot of time for us to dig in and to kind of make sense of the story and to put this time.
This is the point where the story stops feeling like distant nostalgia and starts feeling uncomfortably present, because the same names keep surfacing across decades, not because time froze, but because power rarely moves unless it's forced to. What's changed now isn't just the details, it's the audience. No longer just fans or critics, but jurors, judges, and people with no emotional investment in mythology. And when myths collide with legal procedure, something always gives. Insiders say everyone involved understands the coming months aren't about proving one isolated claim, but about whether the entire structure can survive sustained daylight. Because once that exposure happens, control is almost impossible to reclaim. So the questions pile up and refuse to settle. If money is the true language of power, who was really meant to be paid, and why didn't it happen? If fear explains the silence, how many stories are still waiting for the right moment? If it's all nonsense, why do the reactions feel so tightly managed? And if the past keeps being used as leverage in the present, what exactly is still being protected? At this stage, it feels less like history and more like something unfolding in real time, with everyone watching, weighing the gaps, choosing sides, and waiting to see what finally cracks.